Welcome to our deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking into something pretty fascinating, I think. It's this idea of implicit bias and how it kind of sneaks into all of our lives. We're going to be using Biased by Jennifer Eberhardt to guide us along the way.
Well, one of the most important things to remember when we're talking about this is that it's not about being a bad person, right? Like implicit bias, it's something we all experience.
It is.
It's how our brains work.
Yeah.
Our brains are always trying to categorize information, make sense of the world, and sometimes, unfortunately, those categories can get mixed up with stereotypes, even prejudices, and we might not even realize it.
So you're saying, we all walk around with these, hidden biases that are affecting how we see things.
It's like wearing glasses that distort your vision. You might not even realize you're wearing them, but they're changing how you see everything.
Okay, I'm starting to see the picture here. So where does this biased book fit in? What does it tell us about all this?
Eberhardt uses this really powerful story about her 5-year-old son. They were on a plane, and her son sees a black man. And immediately, he just assumes that this man must be a robber.
Wow. 5 years old. That's a powerful example.
It shows how early these biases can start to develop.
And it makes you wonder, where do they come from?
It's a combination of things, really.
Right.
Our upbringing, the messages we get from society, our own personal experiences, they all kind of mix together.
Yeah, I get that. But how does this implicit bias thing play out, in everyday life? Not just with kids on planes, but for grown-ups too.
Well, Eberhardt tells another story. This time it's about an undercover police officer. The officer is tailing a suspicious-looking black man. But then he realizes something. He's actually profiling his own reflection in a mirrored wall.
Oh, wow. You're kidding. That's a big wake-up call right there. If even a police officer, someone trained to be objective, can fall prey to this, it really shows how deeply ingrained it is.
Right. It proves that implicit bias goes beyond our conscious beliefs. It's about these automatic associations our brain makes, even if we don't agree with them.
So you mean we're not necessarily racist or prejudiced, but our brains are still making these connections without us knowing?
Precisely. And it's not just about our thoughts, it's about how we act based on those thoughts. It impacts our perceptions and then our actions.
Okay, I'm with you. So tell me, what's this I hear about the other race effect?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It's basically the idea that it's harder for us to distinguish between faces of different races.
Really? Is that prejudice or something?
No, not necessarily. It's more about exposure.
Yeah.
Our brains get better at recognizing faces we see often. Think about it. You're probably way better at spotting subtle differences in the faces of people from your own race compared to someone from a different background.
That makes sense, I guess. But why does that even matter?
Well, Eberhardt uses this case in Oakland as an example. There were all these Asian women getting robbed by young black men. And the police, they were making arrests, but the victims couldn't pick the guys out of a lineup, even after specific training.
Wait, so even though they saw the robbers, they couldn't identify them?
Exactly. They were struggling to tell the faces apart because they weren't as familiar with distinguishing between black faces. Sadly, that led to a sense of, impunity for the robbers.
Impunity, you mean they knew they could get away with it?
Yeah, and it made them target these women specifically because they knew it would be harder to identify them.
Wow, that's pretty scary to think about. So it's not just about, recognizing someone, it's about how this other race effect can impact safety and even justice. But Eberhardt's work isn't just about facial recognition, though, right? There's got to be more to it.
Absolutely. It's about the bigger picture, how we categorize people without even thinking, and how those categories can trigger unconscious biases, even prejudices. It's a natural thing our brains do, but sometimes it can be problematic.
So you mean even though we're not trying to be biased, our brains just kind of do it automatically, and that can have real consequences?
Yeah.
But how exactly?
Well, those social categories we talked about, they often come with a lot of baggage, right? Historical narratives, stereotypes, cultural messages, personal experiences, they all contribute. And sometimes those things trigger automatic associations that influence how we see and interact with others, whether we realize it or not.
So our brains are taking shortcuts to make sense of things, but those shortcuts can lead us down the wrong path sometimes.
Exactly. And that leads us to the question of how these biases actually show up in our lives. Because it's not just about how we think, it's about how we act.
So it's not just about how we think, but about how we act. That's kind of a scary thought. What kinds of actions are we talking about here?
Well, it affects all sorts of things, even how we perceive objects. There's this one study Eberhardt talks about that's pretty fascinating. They showed people either black or white faces, but just for a split second. So fast you wouldn't even realize you saw them.
Okay, so they flashed these faces super quick. What then?
Then they asked people to identify different objects, and guess what? The people who saw black faces were way faster at picking out things related to crime, like guns.
Whoa, that's wild. So, like, seeing a black face, even if you don't consciously register it, can make you more likely to see a gun.
It seems that way. It suggests that all those negative associations between black people and crime that we've absorbed over time, it's like they're changing how we see the world.
That's pretty messed up. I mean, what does that mean for real life situations? Like, imagine a police officer who has to make a split-second decision about whether someone is armed or not.
You're hitting on a really important point. Eberhardt talks about those shoot, don't shoot simulations where people have to decide super fast whether to fire at someone holding a gun or something harmless.
Right, I've heard about those. Aren't they designed to help train police officers?
Exactly. But the thing is, the results show a really disturbing pattern. People are way more likely to mistakenly shoot an unarmed black man compared to an unarmed white man.
That's terrifying. So even when people are trying their best to be fair, these implicit biases can still take over.
It's scary how powerful these unconscious influences can be, even in life or death situations. And it's not just individuals, it's baked into the system too, what Eberhardt calls institutional bias. And one of the biggest examples of that is the criminal justice system.
So you're saying that the whole system is biased against black people, but how? I mean, aren't there laws and rules in place to make sure everyone's treated equally?
In theory, yes. But Eberhardt's work with the Oakland Police Department showed some pretty alarming things. They found that black people were being stopped and searched way more often, even when you account for things like crime rates.
So it wasn't that there was more crime in those neighborhoods, it was that the police were targeting black people specifically.
It sure seems that way. When you dig deeper, she talks about how officers are constantly bombarded with these radio calls that say male black over and over, always linked to crime. It's like this constant reinforcement of a negative stereotype.
It's like you're being trained to associate blackness with crime, even if you don't want to. But does it go beyond just traffic stops?
Oh yeah, the whole system is affected. Take plea bargaining, for example. It's supposed to help streamline things, but it can also put a ton of pressure on innocent people, especially black people, to plead guilty, even if they're not, just to avoid the risks of a trial.
So it's like they're being forced into a corner where they have to choose between fighting a system that's stacked against them or taking a deal, even if they're innocent.
Exactly. And then you've got algorithms being used for things like deciding bail. It sounds objective, but those algorithms often take into account things like job stability and family resources, which, because of systemic racism, can disadvantage black men who are statistically more likely to be unemployed or struggling financially.
So even seemingly neutral algorithms can end up reinforcing existing inequalities because they're based on biased data. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But this bias, it can't just be limited to the criminal justice system, can it? What about other areas of life?
Oh, it's everywhere. Housing, homelessness, even how we view entire neighborhoods. Eberhardt explains that it goes way back, to those historical narratives about race, slavery, segregation, all of that.
You mean how those stories, those beliefs have seeped into our understanding of race and continue to affect our perceptions even today?
Right. And they've created this strong association between blackness and poverty, crime, danger, and it can make people perceive black neighborhoods as inherently unsafe, even if the statistics don't back that up.
That's how you get white flight and ongoing segregation. And I guess it can even affect how we see homeless people, like assuming they're all lazy or dangerous just because they're homeless.
It's dehumanizing.
Yeah.
And Eberhardt points to brain imaging studies that show when people look at images of homeless people, it triggers a disgust response in their brains rather than empathy.
Wow, it's like those biases literally shut down our ability to see another human being as deserving of compassion. It's so easy to justify mistreating people when you don't see them as fully human.
And, Eberhardt actually challenges some of those common strategies for dealing with bias, like colorblindness.
Colorblindness, you mean like pretending that race doesn't exist? I guess that seems well-intentioned, but...
Right, but Eberhardt argues that it can actually be harmful because by ignoring race, you're also ignoring the systemic inequalities that are tied to race. You're avoiding those difficult conversations that need to happen.
So she's saying we need to acknowledge those differences, understand the history, in order to truly achieve equality.
Exactly. And she looks at how companies like Airbnb and Nextdoor are tackling this issue on their platforms, which is promising.
Wait, what are they doing?
Well, Airbnb has these anti-discrimination policies, and they're encouraging people to use their instant book feature, so hosts don't even see a potential guest's photo before accepting their booking.
So they're trying to remove those visual cues that might trigger bias.
Exactly. And next door, they're all about connecting neighbors, but they had an issue with racial profiling. So they're trying to crack down on vague posts about suspicious people and encouraging users to be more specific.
It's interesting how these companies are trying to use technology and design to address these really complex social problems.
Right. It shows that people are starting to understand the importance of tackling this. But individual responsibility plays a huge role too.
So individual responsibility, huh? I mean, that sounds good in theory, but how do we actually do that? It's not like most people think of themselves as biased.
Right. It's tough because these biases are often so deeply ingrained we don't even realize they're there. But Eberhardt tells this story about herself in a grocery store that really highlights this. She sees this black man reaching for something on a high shelf and she feels this twinge of fear.
Wait, Eberhardt, the woman who literally wrote the book on this stuff.
Yeah, that's the point. She's dedicated her career to studying this, and yet those automatic reactions still happen.
So it's not about, being a bad person or not. It's about recognizing that we all have these biases no matter who we are or what we know.
Absolutely. It's about paying attention to those gut reactions, questioning our assumptions, and realizing that we're all susceptible to these things.
Okay, so awareness is key. But what about, specific areas where this bias shows up? Eberhardt talks a lot about education, right? That seems like a crucial one.
Yeah, it's so important because education shapes young people's lives.
Yeah.
And one of the things Eberhardt discusses is this study where teachers had to evaluate student misbehavior. The thing is, it was the same behavior, just attributed to different students. And guess what? They saw the same misbehavior as more serious when it was a black student.
Seriously, just because of the student's race.
Yep. And it even affected their disciplinary recommendations. They were harsher on the black students compared to white students.
So even when kids are doing the same thing, black students are being held to a different standard. It's just not fair.
And it contributes to these larger patterns we see, like black students getting suspended or expelled at much higher rates. And those kinds of things can really impact their future opportunities.
It's heartbreaking. But Eberhardt also talks about, the challenges of school integration, right? I mean, isn't diversity supposed to be a good thing?
It is. But just throwing different groups of people together doesn't automatically solve the problem.
Okay.
Eberhardt actually shares her own experiences going to a mostly white school. She was super smart, but she still felt isolated, like she didn't really belong.
So it's not just about diversity. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels welcome, respected, and like they have the same chances to succeed.
Exactly. And this whole thing about belonging, it plays out in the workplace too. Eberhardt did research on hiring practices, and it turns out that people with black-sounding names on their resumes, they get way fewer callbacks for jobs, even when their qualifications are the same as someone with a white-sounding name.
You mean they're being judged before they even get a chance to prove themselves?
That's the insidious thing about implicit bias. It can affect decisions without us even realizing it. And it doesn't stop there. It can also influence performance reviews, promotions, even how colleagues interact with each other.
So it's like this constant undercurrent of bias that affects every aspect of work life.
Remember that story about the two black men who were arrested at a Starbucks in Philadelphia? Just for sitting there, waiting for a meeting.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It was all over the news. It really sparked a conversation about racial profiling.
And for good reason. It shows how these biases can lead to real harm, even in seemingly ordinary situations.
Starbucks ended up doing that implicit bias training for all their employees, right? I guess that's a start, but is it enough?
Well, Eberhardt is pretty clear that training alone isn't a magic solution. It's got to be part of a bigger effort that includes things like diversifying leadership, having clear policies against discrimination, and actually holding people accountable for their actions.
So it's about changing the systems, not just trying to change individual minds. But where do we even start? This all feels so overwhelming.
Eberhardt says we have to be mindful of those automatic reactions. And she suggests things like trying to imagine people who defy stereotypes, or practicing perspective-taking, putting ourselves in someone else's shoes.
So not pretending that race doesn't matter, but actively trying to understand different experiences and challenge our own biases.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process, but it's crucial if we want to create a world where everyone has a fair shot.
Well, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener. Implicit bias is clearly a huge issue, but the more we understand it, the better equipped we are to address it.
I couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power.
Everyone, if you want to explore this more, I highly recommend checking out Bias by Jennifer Eberhardt. It's a fascinating and important read. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive into implicit bias. We'll see you next time.